Hey, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. And this week we had the opportunity to work on one of the most interesting texts in the scripture, often a controversial text, Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. This is the initial creation story that's a standalone unit. The second creation story in Genesis 2:4 through 2:25 actually is part of the wider segment 2:4 to 4:26, which you're working on now. I want to lay out a little bit of the structure of 1:1 to 2:3, and you can compare your notes. If you have any questions, go ahead and you can raise those in the forum. Also, make sure that you watch the other videos that I have that give a little bit of interpretive insight into these chapters, and we can talk more about these. I mean, one of the things that's tough about this particular course is we're working through the inductive Bible study process with it, is that we're missing some of the opportunity to really talk about the richness here in the theology, but I'm happy to discuss that in the forum, so we can raise some of that if you want, even when you come to the actual intensive later on in the semester. So anyway, let's have a look at Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. The first structure essentially, well, actually, let's look at the main units and such first of all. And so the text essentially breaks up into three pieces, in my opinion, and some of this turns on what you do with verse 2 and verse 1 in the translation, which I'll mention here in a minute. But for now, let's go ahead and break this text up into three larger sections. And in my mind, the three sections would be verses 1:1 to 2. But again, some of this is going to turn on the translation, and I'll mention this again. As you may know, the several of the translations and the more traditional translations takes 1:1 really as a superscription for this unit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I actually presume that actually is the correct translation. But we also do have to note that there are strong arguments. There's several different ways to actually translate these first couple verses, and the issue turns on is verse 1 an independent clause, or is it a dependent clause? The traditional translation takes as an independent clause. If it's a dependent clause, meaning it begins with the word when, is the independent clause verse 2, or is the independent clause not until you get to verse 3? And you can find different translations that line up with those. But for our purposes, let's go ahead and say the first two verses are their own unit. Again, I'll show you a couple of different structures, and you could arguably collapse verse 2 into the next verses. The second main unit is the main section of this would be the 6 days of creation. And this runs from verse 1:3 all the way down to verse 31. And then our final section will be Sabbath, and that's 2:1 to 3. Now, within these, obviously, we would break up, if this is two verses, we would have really two subunits in this first section. Verse 1, which is the announcing that God's the creator, and then verse 2, which would be the messy conditions at which the normal part of the creation works. So this is actually kind of we might call it the pre-creation mix, or the raw material out of which God then finishes the work of creation, verses 1 and 2. Now, verses 1 to 3 break up a little bit easier, but I'm going to make this into essentially two sections. I'm going to do A is going to be days 1 to 3, which is focusing on separation, and days 4 to 6, which focuses on filling. And you probably noted, and again, this would then actually have to have three sections. Day 1, day 4, day 2, day 5, and day 3 goes to day 6. And then day 6 is the longest part of the creational account and breaks really into two pieces. Verses 24 and 25, and then verses 26 to 31, which is the creation of humanity. So day 6 is filling the earth. Filling, this is the sun, moon, stars. Filling the day-night. Again, I should be getting ahead of myself. This is the separate night from day. This is separating waters above, waters below. This is separating the earth from the actual, from the sea. And then each of these other days then fill these patterns. So we have the sun, moon, and stars. Waters above, you get birds. Waters below, you get fish. Because what else would be in those kind of waters? And then day 6, you get you get animals on the earth, on the land, and then powerfully and finally you get the creation of humanity here. Now, please note this pattern. What would this be called here? Notice that within this major unit, again, remember, major structures either control 50% of the material or they connect main units. This middle unit is way over 50%. So the structures that we observe here function as main units. There's a couple of things. Notice that this is essentially a recurrence of particularization. It's based on a pattern for one thing, but notice the particularization. We're moving from separation to filling. So that's the particularization here, okay? And that's, we're getting at that. The second thing that you want to note, and there's another recurrence here that goes throughout these 6 days, it's a recurrence of creational pattern. Part of these texts are to show the orderliness of creation. And so we have essentially 6 recurring patterns. Day 6 is a little bit different. It's expanded, but essentially we have divine announcement, report of completion, evaluation, and the report that the day passes. So that's the creational pattern that shows up here. It happens 6 times. And we want to note that here there's a climax. It's a recurrence of creational pattern with a climax. And the climax of this middle section, again, this is critical, it's the middle section here, is the climax of the actual 6 days of creation is humanity. And you probably observed that everything is good, 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 good. And there's even a good right here. But then after humanity's created, everything's done, and then it becomes very good. Okay, so that's part of this climax. So there's a climax here. So in these middle sections, we have a recurrence of particularization. Kind of each days 1 through 3 essentially are a general statement talking about separating, and then it's filled. Okay, so that's this middle section. Now, what we also want to observe is what's going on with the structures elsewhere. Well, here, again, this depends on how this is going. If verse 1 is a superscription by itself, meaning it's not a dependent clause and it's in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, what does this become? This becomes a general statement then that the rest of the text particularizes, right? So if verse 1 is an independent clause, in the beginning, verse 1 then functions as a general statement that's then particularized. And the particulars then would be 1, 2, all the way through 2, 3. Okay, so if 1, 1 is an independent clause, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, then the rest of this is the particulars. Now, verse 2 in this scheme would be an introduction by giving us the backdrop. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's a categorical claim, right? So verse 2 in that schema is just essentially announcing the state before God actually brings order to it, right? And so verse 2 gives us background. So we would call verse 2 an introduction, the way that I've set it up, right? So there's another structure. We have, again, another particularization. Again, this is assuming 1, 1 is a general statement, and then the particulars are 1, 2 to 2, 3. Again, make sure in your work that you're actually explaining these and writing down things. I'm using my words in the video, but make sure you're giving several sentences that describe your structures here. Then I'd also say that we have introductory materials, or preparation realization, and that would essentially be 1, 2 introduces the work of creation itself. Okay, the last structure, and this is important, the actual climax for our entire segment is Sabbath, because this brings the text to a climax because God rests. Creation is already finished at day 6, but then God institutes the Sabbath. And here, I think, we have two pieces. We would divide this section into verse 1 and then verses 2 to 3. This is just the statement of completion. And this is the actual Sabbath report. And this is, I think, without question, the full climax of everything is the Sabbath here. Again, other possible structures. Notice I have some complex things here, but this essentially breaks up the text. And the things that you want to see is to see the orderly pattern that's presented. I'll bring some of these things out in my explanations of my work. But again, what this does is it divides this text into 3 main units, and then there's 2 main units in the second section, and I've gone down to sub-units just to make sense of days 1 to 6. As you work with IBS and begin to make the method your own, you can be flexible. Again, I think there's maybe some other ways of doing this, but what I like doing, what you're going to see in my work, I like to have as few units as possible, simply because what's the point of complexity? We want to be precise, because I think what you can all say, whether you fully agree with what I've done or not, that this is straightforward and simple. At least it is to me, because I mean that's what you got to do, right? You should at least be confident of your own work. And again, I could be wrong, and I look forward to hearing some conversation about this. If you have any questions, jump in the forum. Let's talk about it. Again, what you also want to go on and do is look at strategic areas, and ask questions of all of these texts. Make sure you've asked your definitional, your rational, and your implicational for each structure, and then have a strategic area. So like an obvious strategic area for the climax would be verses 2 and 3. Obvious strategic area for this particularization would be the beginning of verse 1, which would probably be good to look at anyway, simply so you can figure out what are the issues with the translation. You could also pick as a climax or as a strategic area for this recurrence of creational pattern, would be the creation of humanity. That seems to be significant because it's the climactic part of the actual middle section. Introduction, verse 2 could also be a strategic area. Again, I think that's enough. This has been about 15 minutes. Again, we could say more. Brian Russell, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.